two Protestant ministers, Reverend Taylor and Reverend Gray, and they were working in the same small little city, and they didn't much like each other, but they had to work together for lots of years. And a kind of begrudging respect developed between the two. And one day, Reverend Taylor had to introduce Reverend Gray on a stage. So he pointed there and he said, so you can see Reverend Gray sitting there. He said, as you people know, Reverend Gray and myself haven't gotten along all that well through all these years. But he said, that's not important. After all, we're both doing the Lord's work, he in his way and I in God's way. Okay. Okay, we are looking at Sabbath. And I want to read you a little kind of a gathering hymn this morning. And first explain who wrote this. If this had been written by an 18-year-old, it wouldn't be as powerful. This was written by an old monk somewhere on in his 80s. And it's a very famous piece. There's a lot of different, I was going to say knockoff pieces on this, and everybody does their own. But this is the original, the one called If I Had to Live My Life Over Again. And it's a Brother Jeremiah. If I had to live my life over again, I would make more mistakes the next time. And I would relax more. I would limber up, and I would be sillier than I was this time. I know a few things I would take as seriously, although I would take more trips. I would climb more mountains, swim more rivers, watch more sunsets, and do more walking and more looking. And I would eat more ice cream and less beans. And I would have more actual troubles and fewer imaginary ones. You see, I have been one of those people who have lived so sensibly and sanely and hurriedly, hour after hour, day after day. Now, I've had my moments, but if I had my life to live over again, I would try to have nothing else, just moments, one after another, instead of living so many years ahead of each day. I have been one of those people who never went anywheres without a thermometer, a hot water bottle, a gargle, a raincoat, an aspirin, and a parachute. If I could live again, I would go to more places, do more things, but I would travel lighter. If I had my life to live again, I would start barefooted earlier in spring and stay that way later into the fall. I would play hooky from work more, and I would ride more merry-go-rounds, and I would pick more daisies. So you can see in his life what he's saying, I would have a little more Sabbath in my life if I had my life to live again. So we're looking at Sabbath, and I want to do two things with you this morning, and they're kind of opposites. This first section, I want to look at you at things inside of us that block Sabbath. Because, you know, we all long for Sabbath. But what blocks Sabbath? And then the second part, we'll look at what really is Sabbath. What does it mean to celebrate, to be in God's presence spiritually, and so on. But this first, I will look at what blocks Sabbath. You know, all of us, we long for solitude. We long for celebration. Why don't we ever, we long to be in the present moment. Why don't we ever quite get there? So I've simply called this session Obstacle to Sabbath, and kind of a convoluted title, but it captures it. I said, our muddied, wearied, overtaxed consciousness, narcissism, pragmatism, and pathological restlessness, which are really our everyday heartaches and headaches. Our muddied, wearied, overtaxed consciousness, narcissism, pragmatism, and pathological restlessness. So the issue is, we all long for solitude. In fact, it's kind of our deepest longing. We long for celebration. We long for Sabbath, and we rarely get there. Why? Well, because there's too many things inside of our consciousness that we're not free. It's so hard for us to ever attain solitude and just to be free of all the anxieties that weigh us down and block us from Sabbath. But what are those anxieties? Well, I'm going to put them into three categories: narcissism, pragmatism, restlessness. But I want to begin with what I call an overarching metaphor. This is a very famous metaphor and one of the really badly misunderstood pieces, and we vilified Nietzsche for this and so on. Remember, he is the first philosopher who coined the expression, God is dead. But it doesn't quite mean what people think it means. He wrote a book called The Gay Science, and he was a brilliant philosopher. But he begins this with this famous image of the shattered lantern, which I once wrote a book on, compliments to Nietzsche. But this is the metaphor of the shattered lantern. It's a powerful metaphor. And it's said 100 years ago, but even more true today. And he sets it in a German city. And in all the old cities, they used to have the town square. Today we call it the mall. Okay. And the town square, because that's where the people come. And that's where the people do commerce. That's where the people dine and shop and sit around. And what happens in our malls today? That's where kind of life takes place. It's at high noon, and that's an important symbol. So it's right at noon when the sun is at its highest. And people are shopping and they're bartering with, and some are sitting around having tea, and some are having beer, and the kids are skipping, and stuff is happening. See, that's ordinary life is happening, ordinary consciousness. And into this town square comes the madman. Every town, village, and stuff has its madman, the eccentric. And this eccentric is coming, and he has a lantern lit. And he's walking around, and he begins to look under benches and different places with his lantern. And so the people tease him. They said, "What are you looking for?" He said, "I'm looking for God. I'm looking for God." And he's looking underneath different benches and burrows and so on. And so the people tease him. They say, "Well, what happened to God? Is he like a child? Did he lose his way? Or did God get lost?" And at a certain point, he goes to the center of the square and he smashes the lantern. That's the shattered lantern. He smashes the lantern and he said, "I won't find him, and neither will you." He said, "Because God is dead." He said, "God is dead, and we're his murderers. We killed God. You don't know how you killed him." He said, "But we killed God, and we're responsible for his death." He said, "But I can see I've announced it too early. You don't understand what I'm saying. You've killed God, and you don't know it, and I've announced it too early." Then as he walked away, he says, "What kind of sponge did we ever use to wipe away an entire horizon?" He leaves. That's the essence of Nietzsche's book. Now, although he himself was an atheist, but he didn't necessarily in this book believe that there is not necessarily a God in heaven. He said there isn't a God in our consciousness. Notice he says, we've killed God and we're his murderers. How? We've killed him in our ordinary consciousness. Notice the symbolism of that. They're in the market squares. That symbolizes ordinary life, high noon. This is when, life's when life is happening at its peak in daylight, at high noon, there is no room for God. See, we kill God how? By pushing God out of our consciousness. That there's no more room. We can still find, like Nietzsche says later on in the book, people still find God in their churches. But once God is pushed out of the marketplaces, it won't be about 100 or 150 years, then God will also be dead in the churches. See, once God dies in our ordinary consciousness, then God is soon going to die as well in the churches. Now, we're somewhere in that period after Nietzsche where we've still got God more or less alive in our churches, but clearly God is pretty dead in our ordinary consciousness. And Henry Nouwen used to say that. Henry Nouwen says, if we're honest, we have to admit that our ordinary consciousness is agnostic, or sometimes even atheistic. So we can pray by going to church or going to a special place, but ordinarily there isn't a place for God inside of our lives and our consciousness. Because we're evil? No. Because precisely our consciousness is absorbed habitually by three things: narcissism, pragmatism, and excessive restlessness. Let's look at them. And we don't have to apologize about that. It cannot not be like that. That's the way we're structured. Okay, we are by our essence. We're narcissistic, we're pragmatic, we're restless. What are those? Let's look at them. First of all, narcissism. Well, that is a word that Freud, the psychologist, gave to us, and it's a pretty new word in the Western vocabulary. The science of psychology as a scientific endeavor is only like 100 to 150 years old. That's relatively new in history, and broken in a lot by Freud, by Jung, and now since then we have all kinds of psychologists and so on. But Freud was one of the pioneers. Incidentally, little humor on Freud. I always tell my students this: Freud is to psychology what Elvis is to music. Okay, he may not be the best, but he's the king. Okay, okay. But Freud gave us this word, and it's after the famous Greek myth. And as you know, the Greek myths, the myth of Sisyphus and so on, all these myths Prometheus, they contain all their psychological wisdom. Before we had the science of psychology, they had mythology. And mythology, they didn't believe these myths, but they were profound. Myths contain deep truths. Let me just give you a simple example. And they contain them in a way that contemporary psychology doesn't contain them. Contemporary psychology is brilliant, but you have to have to go to graduate schools to get it. Whereas the myths try to do that so that little kids can get it. So as an example, remember the story of Cinderella? Well, that isn't just an ordinary little story for kids. That's just, if you want a theology and spirituality of Lent, you got it right there in a very simple little story. And that story is thousands of years old, and it's meant to teach some profound lessons. First of all, Cinderella, that's a made-up name. That's not a woman's name. Cinder means ashes, and Ella means puella. That means the eternal little girl. So it means the little girl who has to sit in the ashes. And she has to sit in the ashes. Why? Well, before you can get to the ball, before you get to marry the prince, before you get to wear the glass slipper, before you get to dance, you have to first spend your time in the ashes. Kind of Lent. Before you get to Easter, you have to first spend 40 days in the ashes. Puella, the eternal. See, now all these stories, they're thousands of years old, and they contain a lot of wisdom. And one such story was the story of Narcissus. So the story goes this way. They say, once upon a time, there was this young man, Greek, Narcissus, and he was hale and handsome. So you got to picture him, this blonde Greek god. And except he was a human being. But in fact, a goddess, a nymph goddess, Echo, fell in love with him, and she kind of pursued him, but he kept running away from her. He would not receive her love, and she kept calling, and he kept going further away until eventually, because she was, had this unrequited love, she just pined away into nothing. She disappeared, and only her voice remained, from where we get the word echo, an echo in the woods. And he didn't respond to her love, but then the great God decided to punish him for his lack of response to her, and he punished him this way, in a very subtle way. Narcissus went to wash in a pond. He had never seen his reflection before. Mirrors weren't invented. And when he saw himself and his beautiful appearance, he was stunned by his own appearance and simply paralyzed by his own appearance. And he never moved again and admired himself in the water until he turned into a flower that now bears his name. Freud picked that up, and he talked about narcissism, and he simply defined it as excessive self-preoccupation. Who hurt me, the loves I don't have, the loneliness that's in me. And you see that René Descartes enshrined that in Western philosophy with this great opening to his philosophy where he says, I think, therefore I am. Notice what Descartes is saying, and in fact it's true. Descartes would say, what is the only thing you know for sure is real? What's inside of you? You're real. Your life. Your pain, your heartaches, your joys. You might be dreaming the whole rest of the world. You may be everything, and everything else around you is the dream. You're real, but how real are other people? How real is the rest of the world? So that we're always partly, except for, as I want to say, in our contemplative and solitude moments, we can't break out of this. We can't break out of our narcissism. And it's very difficult to not be narcissistic. I want to give you a simple example of this, which is so typical. I don't want to pick on these people because it's just this. I'm using this as a sample, a kind of a prototype of all the rest of us. But when I was still living in Edmonton, and I was helping in a marriage course for the Archdiocese there, and every third Monday, I would go to the Catholic Center and I would give a talk to young couples preparing for marriage on the sacrament of marriage. And usually there were like 50 couples there. And these are young people who are choosing to get married inside the church. So this is the green wood. This is not the dry wood, But it was without a variation. I would give a talk for 45 minutes on the sacrament of marriage, and then I would ask, any questions? And this was always the first question, always, Father, why do we have to take this course? But I want you to listen to what they're going to say next, and then tell me whose children these are. Jesus or René Descartes. Very typical. They say, why do I have to take this course? And they'd say this because, like, why are our parents and the church and society try to butt in on our lives? This is my life, my marriage, my sexuality, skin off my teeth if it doesn't work. It has nothing to do with you or the church. Or what's wrong with it? See, that's the lonely voice of René Descartes. I think, therefore I am. Notice what it's saying. This is my life, my choice, my sexuality, my skin off my teeth if it doesn't work. See, that's hardly, St. Paul saying, we're the body of Christ, and the fingers can't say to the hands, we don't need you. We're all part of one corporate. They don't get that. Neither the rest of us, mostly, and so on. See, that's narcissism. It's not that it's a sin or anything. It's just we're so locked inside of ourselves that, and see, then you're going to see it's hard to do Sabbath. It's hard to ever really celebrate. Why? Because we're locked into it. Then perennially, we're locked into the idiosyncratic world, my lonely world. So you can be, this isn't abstract, then you can be walking in the most beautiful, sunny park with birds singing, and you won't notice a thing. You're thinking about the conversation. She said that, and I said that. See, it doesn't matter. You could be walking in a dark basement. Wouldn't make any difference at all. So the outside world doesn't exist. I'm walking, it's my heartache, and then she said that, and I shouldn't have said that, or maybe I should have said that, and God, who does he think he is? And see, we're locked inside of our world. There's no Sabbath. There's no contemplative. There's no solitude. We're locked in our heartaches. See, heartaches can simply take us, and we're driving to work. What are we thinking about, or whatever? We're replaying the conversations. Now, to give you some consolation, Freud, see, and that is technically neuroses. That's exactly what neurosis is. See, neurosis is, and Freud says, this is the consoling part, Freud said neurosis is the disease of the normal person. So you don't want to be psychotic. That's crazy. You don't want that, Although you'd be a lot happier. Psychotics tend to really be happier than us neurotics, but we're normal, okay? See, and neurosis, that's simply when we stew in our own juices, See, when excessive self-preoccupation, we're stewing in our own juices. And he said that we're playing conversations and old hurts and back and old tapes back and forth and so on. Well, what all those tapes and old hurts and conversations were replaying, and who hurt us, and what did your mother say, and I called her, and my sister should have gone, she didn't go, and so on. See, what it's doing is it's blocking the sunlight, it's blocking the air, it's blocking everything. Classically, and we see that in its prototype, you see that in obsessions. And, kids have a word for that, and I like it. They say, I'm obsessing, or she's obsessing, and so on. See, obsessing is simply a form of narcissism, and it's a really painful thing. You can't breathe. Your whole world goes down unless this person smiles at me or notices me or whatever or apologizes. See, it's manic. We're just going in a circle. And I said it's sympathetic. We all do it. And sometimes the more sensitive you are, the more you'll do it. That's classic obsession. And what it does is it simply strangles us inside. When I was in Belgium, I had a chance to study with one of the really, I think, great psychologists of the last century, a guy called Anton Vergot. And in class, somebody asked him about this once. They said, Doctor, how do you handle obsessions? Because a lot of these people were psychologists and so on. They said, people come in and, there's been a fractured love or something's gone wrong. And he said, these people can't breathe and they can't, they can't sleep and they're suicidal or whatever. What do you do with that? And he said, that's singly the hardest thing in the whole world to handle. He said, in all of psychology, he says, that's the most paralyzing single thing there is. Sometimes you can't do anything, just sit with them. But he says, you know what that is? He said, it's a form of over-concentration. It's a form of over-concentration. He gave us this example, which really struck me. He said when Hegel wrote his famous book on the phenomenology of history, and he worked on that for some years, and he just concentrated and so on. And as soon as he finished, he put his pen down, and he realized he was going to have a nervous breakdown. He was just locked in this world, and he thought, I've thought about this too long. I'm going to go nuts. I'm going to have a nervous breakdown. So what he did is he got on his horse, and he just rode from village to village, and he sat in pubs, and he did everything to kind of somehow break open, and eventually he didn't have the nervous breakdown. He got out of it. But see, no, it's a form of over-concentration. So for instance, when you have a real heartache, an affair ended or something, or your marriage ended, somebody rejected you, or even somebody died or whatever, you can't get your mind off of this, or some hurt. We notice what it is, it's a concentration. We're locked in on one thing, and the air can't get in, the sun can't get in, perspective can't get in, nothing can't get in. See, it's narcissism. And we're always dealing with some form of that, always. We can't help it, because we are inside of ourselves. And then it's difficult. That's why a lot of Sabbaths come and go, and we were never in them. A lot of Christmases come and go, we were never in them. A lot of joyful moments and wonderful dining with family stuff, it comes and goes, and we're not there. And those of you who are parents, you see it in your teenagers. You're having this dinner, they're at the table, but they're not there. They need not even be in the room. They're there, but they're not there. Well, it's the same with life. We're not there. And sometimes we're not inside of our own lives. Just most of the time, we're not inside of our own lives. And don't even feel bad about that. Remember Augustine's great line after he converted. And they have that in the office of the church and so on, because it's a beautiful passage where he said, "Late have I loved thee, O beauty, ever ancient, ever new. I was outside of myself, pursuing you. You were inside of me, but I wasn't inside of me." We're outside, we're pursuing beauty, we're pursuing love, we're pursuing all these things. They're inside of us, but I'm not inside of me. See, we're locked into places. See, that's narcissism. And it really blocks us from Sabbath. And as I said, it muddies and it wearies our consciousness. A lot of times when we're tired, we're fatigued. A lot of times that's not physical, it's just the heart's getting worn down. And I say this sympathetically. It's not like there's some magic wand or we're wrong or we're bad because we do this. No, this is just a struggle. We're built with powerful personal instincts, and they're there to protect us. There's a reason why nature and God made us the way we are. And we are built narcissistically and so on. And it protects us, but the idea is to outgrow this, to slowly let your guard down. Let me give you a little spiritual piece on this. Henry Nouwen, it was probably his first book, and maybe it's one of his greatest books that he wrote when he was way back in Notre Dame in 1975. He wrote that book, With Open Hands. Remember that book? And it's a great classic. If you haven't read it, just read it. It's a very simple little book. But he talks about the difference between metanoia and paranoia, which isn't just a pun in Greek. But in the New Testament, which was written in Greek, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, these are the first word out of Jesus' mouth is the word metanoia. Do metanoia, okay? And we always translate that word in English as repent. Maybe not such a good translation. I don't know how you translate it because it's such a rich word. But the word metanoia has about 3 different levels to it. First of all, the word meta means above, and noia means mind. It means get above your mind. Get above kind of your ordinary mind, okay? And then metanoia means to turn around, to literally be facing one direction and turn around and face a different direction. But metanoia is also a pun against paranoia. It's the unparanoia. Now, Nouwen takes this last piece, and it's beautiful. He says, when Jesus says, do metanoia, basically saying, become unparanoid. See, the posture of paranoia is the posture of the clenched fist. When somebody's studying, I want to protect myself. And we see the world and we see danger out there and see, I got to protect myself, otherwise I could get hurt. That's paranoia. Then metanoia is Jesus on the cross. Notice Jesus on the cross, and throughout his life, Jesus never protects himself. They strip him naked and he's hanging with his hands open, his arms open, nails through open hands. That's unparanoia. Jesus doesn't protect himself. Incidentally, today, oftentimes in the church, we're far too concerned about protecting ourselves and protecting Jesus and protecting this. And notice Jesus wasn't much into protecting anything. put it out there. Okay. See, now, we are built, and that's why spirituality and humanity and stuff is partly developmental. We're built with powerful instincts to protect ourselves, and that's part of our narcissism. As we age and get older and mature, more and more we got to be able to let go of that, let go of it, let go of it. Because of that, when I look at the last part of this, it makes it difficult for us to do Sabbath, because it makes it difficult for us to give anybody or anything the gaze of admiration, or simply the simple, what Erickson, this great psychologist, called appreciative consciousness, where you simply appreciate and you give the gaze of admiration. What does that mean? I want to use an example. If you've ever read the book, which is a classic, this is a classic, probably the only book of his I could ever understand, but James Joyce, his book called A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Now, all his other books are too dense and, Ulysses and stuff. If you can understand them, explain them to me and to other people, okay? But Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, I think I kind of understand that. But there's a powerful passage in there, and it's partly a kind of an autobiographical thing for Joyce. And he describes himself as a young man, okay? And he's an artist, but he doesn't really know it. But at a certain point, he knows he's an artist. And it happens this. So this is kind of earthy, but it's a wonderful, beautiful illustrative passage. But he's a young guy, and he's out walking on the seashore one day, on a beautiful day, and so on, absorbed inside of himself, his problems and his art and his loneliness and so on. And he sees a young woman bathing with very few clothes on against the sun and the waves and so on. And that this is, the beauty of her body, of the sun, the waves, and so on. But being a young guy, initially, his thing is, I'm going to get in the rocks and have a good look at this, But as he said, all of a sudden, it's transformed. He's not thinking sexually, and he's not thinking possessively, and he's not thinking this. He just realizes he's seeing something of spectacular beauty. And he doesn't need to own this thing or lust after it or anything. He just needs to admire it. See, the pure aesthetic gaze. He's standing here, wow, this is as good as God does. This is just spectacular beauty. But our normal movement for beauty is that somehow I got to own it. Somehow I got to press it to me or whatever. You know who Eddie Hilsum was? She was a young Jewish woman who was killed by the Nazis in Westerbork, a concentration camp, but wrote these diaries, and they're powerful. She didn't have a lot of faith, but she really came to a certain both secular and sacred sanctity before she died. But now listen to this. This is from her diary called An Interrupted Life. And here I hit upon something essential. Whenever I saw a beautiful flower, what I longed to do was to press it to my heart, or to eat it all up. It was more difficult with a piece of beautiful scenery, but the feeling was the same. I was too sensual. I might almost write too greedy. I yearned physically for all I thought was beautiful, and I wanted to own it. Hence the painful longing that could never be satisfied, the pining for something I thought unattainable, which I called my creative urge. I believe it was this powerful emotion that made me think that I was born to produce great works. It all changed suddenly. God alone knows by what inner process, but it is different now. I realized it only this morning when I recalled my short walk around the skating club a few nights ago. It was dusk, soft hues in the sky, mysterious silhouettes of houses, trees alive with the light through the tracery of their branches, in short, enchanting. And then I knew precisely how I had felt in the past. Then all that beauty would have gone like a stab to my heart, and I would not have known what to do with the pain. Then I would have felt the need to write, to compose verses, but the words would have refused to come, and I would have felt utterly miserable, wallowed in pain, and exhausted myself as a result. The experience would have sapped all my energy. Now I know that for what it was, mental masturbation. But that night, only just gone, I reacted quite differently. I felt that God's world was beautiful despite everything, but its beauty now filled me with joy. I was just as deeply moved by that mysterious, still landscape in the dust as I might have been before, but somehow I no longer wanted to own it. I went home invigorated and got to work, and the scenery stayed with me in the background as a cloak about my soul, to put it poetically. But it no longer held me back. I no longer masturbated with it. It's a powerful piece. And she describes something, so often, experience of great beauty and so on. You know what it does? It goes like a stab to the heart. You ever notice sometimes that, our greatest, what should be our most joyful events, weddings, galas, commencements, people go there and, you buy expensive clothing, you get your hair done, and you come home exhausted. Why? Because all this beauty, it just fires our grandiosity and narcissism, and we get so restless we can't sit still. And you notice the opposite at a funeral. The most contemplative events you go to every year are funerals. The sadder the funeral, the more at peace there is sometimes. Nobody has to show off. You don't try to own anything. See, funerals are like little psychic sticks of dynamite. They dynamite our narcissism, and they dynamite our pragmatism. They bring us out, and so we're just there. We're at our best. But see, that's our struggle to get to Sabbath, the first part, narcissism. Pragmatism. American life is identified with this, and probably rightly so, but the same with Western Europe. Pragmatism, what is it? I want to begin with a little story from Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton was once interviewed by a journalist. She says, "Father, what would you consider the leading disease, spiritual disease, inside of American culture?" And of all the things Merton might have said, what's the leading spiritual disease inside of our culture, we don't care about the poor, we're greedy, we're narcissistic, whatever. He didn't say any of these. Merton says efficiency. He said the biggest spiritual disease inside of American culture is efficiency. He said because from the Pentagon down to the nursery, the plant has to run, and by the time we keep the plant running, there is no time or energy or focus for anything else. Right from the White House to the nursery, we got to keep the plant running. And by the time we get that done, there's no room or energy for anything else. See, narcissism has to do with our heartaches. Pragmatism has to do with our headaches. The business of making a living. So many times we're so consumed with the business of making a living, we never get around to living. The piece I read you from Brother Jeremiah, notice he says, "This time around I've been so consumed with the business of making a living that I never got around very often to actually living." It's just sitting barefoot in the grass and so on. Why? There's no time. See, the word pragmatism. Pragmatism literally means, pragma means business. It means what works. John Dewey, our great philosopher, the pragmatic philosopher, philosophers up to Dewey used to define truth theoretically. Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle. Truth is the adequation of the object to the intellect. What's inside of you has to correspond to what's outside of you. That's the theoretical definition of truth. John Dewey says, no, truth is what works. And see, then we get a pragmatic definition of truth, which has many, many upsides to it. That helps produce technology and efficiency and so on. But the downside is that we tend to then take our worth and our self-worth not from what we are, but from what we do. What's the first question we ask people when we meet them? What do you do? We never say, who are you? What do you do? Well, I'm an executive for Texaco. Okay, What do you do? Well, actually, I'm unemployed and I'm living with my parents. Okay. That'll stop a conversation real quick, Okay. See, our worth is, what do we do? And we feel good when we're achieving. We don't feel good when we're not achieving. And then our lives get very, very consumed precisely with achieving, with doing, with our jobs, with performance. And then all kinds of things like unemployment, sickness, aging, they become devastating because we define people not by who they are, but by what they can do. We define things by their utility, not in our worth comes out of that. And so consequently what happens, we become very, very absorbed with the doing. And it shows in every aspect of our lives. Just to give some examples. For instance, in the United States and Western Europe, and the secularized parts of our world, which are highly pragmatic cultures, crassly put, we eat the best food of anybody in the whole world, and we probably enjoy it the least. Because we're never attentive, we're so, between our narcissism, our heartaches, but then our headaches, we're too busy, we're inhaling food, we're on the run, there isn't any time, and then besides that, you have to be slim in our culture, so you're not allowed to eat what you want anyway, and so you're kind of inhaling some salad with no dressing some other place and so on. So we have all this stuff, but there's no time or place or space to enjoy it. It's hard to do Sabbath. We're too busy. Or the point I made last night, we've lived too long where we can be reached. Your job, your cell phone, the internet, everything, just there isn't any time, And even the word multitasking, that's a wonderful word in the business world. It's a terrible word in the contemplative world, multitasking. We're not supposed to be doing anything. And here we're trying to do three things, When we're trying to do three things at the same time, you can be sure there's going to be no Sabbath in our lives. Sabbath means not doing anything, And see, we're so powerfully driven. And we are the most efficient people in history by a long shot. And the new technology of internet, of email, of cell phones is making us even way more efficient than anybody has ever been in history, okay? It's not exactly making us contemplative. One of my professors is a brilliant old Dominican, Jan Walgrave in Belgium, and he used to say, he says, Western culture right now constitutes a virtual conspiracy against interiority. What he's saying is not that there's some conscious conspiracy out there, but precisely, we're too busy, there's too much stuff happening, and this isn't abstract. We live very busy, pressured lives. You get home at night after work and so on, and then you do your supper and you get your day started, and now it's 8:30, 9 o'clock or something. Well, now you could read, or journal, or pray, but we're too tired. So we're going to watch a rerun of Seinfeld, or Everybody Loves Raymond, or something so we can sleep. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just, there's no depth to it either, And so, it's like a little tonic. It's like a drink you take so you can sleep and so on. And it's okay if you do that one night or two nights. It's not okay if we do it every night. See, after all, there's no room for depth in our lives. We also need good bouts of superficiality in our lives. They keep us grounded and sleeping and so on. If you have depth all the time, you go psychotic. You need some really healthy, superficial things going on sometimes. But they got to be balanced off. There's got to be times of depth. And in our lives, our problem isn't badness, our problem is busyness. We are just flat out too busy and perennially tired and wearied to do depth. We just don't do it. There's no time. We're too pragmatic, And then as soon as you try to do it, your cell phone's going to ring. And you haven't checked your email and a few other things. It's not going to happen. Okay, pragmatism. And lastly, our excessive restlessness. It ties to the other two, particularly to narcissism, but it's a separate piece. So we struggle with our heartaches. We struggle with our agenda and our busyness and our headaches, but we also struggle with restlessness. And restlessness is something that, first of all, is innate inside of us. You've made us for yourself, Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So there's always a restlessness inside of us, except in our culture, the culture and the way we live is fanning the restlessness. It's making it, it's intensifying it. As Teilhard de Chardin, a wonderful expression, he said, it's raising our psychic temperature. The same way as your body has a temperature. A doctor sticks a thermometer into your body and tells you, you're a bit feverish, your body has got too high a temperature. Well, if they could stick a thermometer into our psyche sometimes, they'd find out that we are running at quite a fever, because we are being stimulated and overstimulated almost all the time. See, it's normal to be restless. As Henry Nouwen used to say, we aren't rest-filled people who occasionally become restless. We're restless people who sometimes find rest. But today, constant media, constant interaction, constant everything, larger cities, and the cult of fame and fortune and the body and so on, what it's doing is it's overstimulating our grandiosity. It's overstimulating our restlessness. So it becomes hard just to come to simple rest. There's too many things, and you see it with little kids. There's too many things. The kid doesn't want to go to bed. I'm going to miss something, And we stay up later because we don't want to miss something. And even though we're tired, we can't bring ourselves to rest because we're all overstimulated. We're all over restless and so on. And so that it makes it hard for us just to shut down the engines and to come to Sabbath. And as I said before, you see that. I don't want to pick on kids, but they show it more clearly because they're more emotionally honest. So you're having your family dinner, and your 16-year-old's there, but the 16-year-old first isn't there. And they're at the table, and they're restless, and they're fidgeting, and how soon can I go? And I'm restless and fidgeting, and how soon? You see, restlessness. But we're all a little bit like that. In fact, last Sunday, on the Sunday cartoon, there was a great cartoon that I clipped out, a little parable of our age, and the cartoon Zitz, and this 16-year-old Jeremy or whatever, and he's on vacation with his parents, and they're at the Grand Canyon, and the mom and dad are oohing and awing, and the young kid is, I'm so bored, how soon can we leave, Then they're out Mount Rushmore, and his parents are photographing this, I'm bored, how soon can I get out of here, and so on, all these great sights. Then they walk by a mall, and there's a new cell phone in the window, and he's standing, wow. Okay. Parable of our age. Okay. Now, this is the language today of analysis, narcissism, pragmatism, restlessness. I want to do the last part of this by giving you this in the language of Scripture. I'm going to give you one wonderful, powerful image. And in fact, if you were going to get down to one deeply challenging text in Scripture, pick this one. And it's one that easily escapes us. And it's the washing of the feet in John's Gospel. Okay? And there's many aspects to it. I want to hone in on one aspect, and that is that what narcissism, pragmatism, restlessness do, they make us asleep to our true identity. And then they keep us inside of our, scripturally, John would say that we're in our outer garments and we never get to our inner garment. Now, let's look at that. Kind of hone in on this text. In John's Gospel, at the Last Supper, in place of the Eucharist, it's very interesting. In place of the Eucharist, Jesus doesn't bring out bread and wine, he brings out a basin and a towel, which is altogether interesting, as the Irish say. In John's Gospel, there's no bread and wine at the Last Supper. The Eucharist has already happened in chapter 6, and it's connected to the bread of life. But in place of the bread and wine, Jesus brings out the basin and towel. And John puts it this way. He said, at the supper, knowing he had come from God and knowing he was going back to God and that therefore all things were possible for him, Jesus got up from the table, took off his outer garment, and wearing only his inner garment began to wash the disciples' feet, much to their protests. What's behind that text and what does that text mean? Well, we always take that text, and it has different levels. So our preaching on it hasn't been wrong. It hasn't been very deep, but it hasn't been wrong. We've always taken that as a thing of humility. Jesus, the master, washes the disciples' feet. And that's the way the songs have been written about it. And that part is true, See, the master washes the disciples' feet. What a wonderful act of humility. That's true. It's not the deepest part of the text. I remember one poet, beautiful line, he says, at the Last Supper, Jesus got up from the table and he took the mantle of privilege and reversed it and turned it into the apron of service. It's a good line. It's not the deepest line, but it's a good line. Okay. What's really happening there? Well, what's the gesture of washing the feet and what's the outer inner garment play there? Little background to that text. Scholars would estimate that the Gospel of John was written somewhere between the years 90 and 100. Why is that important? Well, notice that's pretty late in the game. Jesus has been dead for about 60 or 70 years. And there's been like about 60 or 70 years of church life has happened already by then. John is the last living apostle, and he's got to be about 90 years old. If you do the math, if Jesus died in 33, and this is the year 90 or 95 or 97, if he was 25 or 30, he's going to be about 90 years old now, okay? So it's an old man. He's the last living apostle. It's the last testimony, and he's already seen about 65 years of church life, and he hasn't always liked what he's seen. Okay. Yeah, because you know why? Because they were already fighting about everything, especially about Eucharist, how often it should be celebrated, what it should be called, who should be presiding, and on, the way we do today. Okay. So when they come to the Eucharist, John inserts this text of the washing of the feet. So instead of the bread and wine, he has the basin and the towel. But it is a gesture of humility, but a gesture of humility in a very deep way in this sense. Let me try to risk illustrating what he means by that. See, to wash somebody's feet, not just to wash anybody's feet, it's this sense. If John were here today, let's take an example. What is the most divisive moral issue in our whole culture? Abortion. Okay. You know what he would do if he were here today? He'd say, let's not argue about it. Let's bring out a basin and towel, and we're going to get pro-life to wash pro-choice's feet. And we're going to get pro-choice to wash pro-life's feet. And then we're going to take the issue of, gay marriage, and we're going to get gay people to wash, Jerry Falwell's feet, and we're going to get they to wash, and then we're going to get Dick Cheney to wash bin Laden's feet, and then we're going to get bin Laden to wash George Bush's feet, and on, and we're going to get Ian Paisley to wash Jerry Adams' feet, and we're going to get Jerry Adams to wash Ian Paisley's feet, and then we'll have some chance for peace in this world. See, the gesture isn't just an ordinary gesture. Can you wash the feet of somebody who's just absolutely different, other than you? See, it's one thing to do humility where it's clean and easy. I'll go down and serve soup at a soup kitchen. Well, that's nice. That doesn't cost me a lot, But if I'd have to serve a bowl of soup to certain people, that would cost me a lot. See, and the washing of the feet is that gesture, but that's one part of it. The part I want to focus in on, what gives Jesus the power to do this? Now, you don't want to miss the line. At the Last Supper, knowing he had come from God and knowing he was going back to God, he got up and took off his outer garment. What's the outer garment? Precisely all those things. I'm liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, feminist, anti-feminist, pro-life, pro-choice, pro-war, against war. Those are all our outer garments. Those are all garments we've put on. None of them is you. Okay, underneath is what? Your true identity. You're in the image and likeness of God. You've come from God. You're going back to God. And when you realize that, he says, then all things are possible. You can wash bin Laden's feet if you take off your outer garments, that you're no longer an American. You're no longer a Republican or a Democrat or a man or a woman or whatever, a liberal or conservative. You're a child of God. And you've come from God and you're going back to God. But normally, and this is the part I want to do, we're asleep to that. In the beautiful way that Luke particularly writes up the Gethsemane account, the agony in the garden. In Luke's account, they come out of the Last Supper room, and they go into the garden, and Jesus gives them a single line. He says, watch. Doesn't say watch with me, stay awake, it says watch. They're supposed to learn something. And so then Jesus has this dialogue with his Father in which, do I have to do this? Is there some way around this? And he finds out there isn't. He's going to have to endure this humiliation to get to Easter Sunday. And then they said after Jesus finally gives his life to his Father, he turns around, and the disciples, were they awake? No, he said they were asleep. They weren't watching. But Luke words this carefully. He says, but they were asleep out of sheer sorrow. See, they weren't asleep because they were tired, and they had a right to be tired. This probably happened around midnight. They had had a long supper, drank 4 cups of wine apiece. I don't like their chances, But that's not why they fell asleep. Luke said they were asleep out of sheer sorrow, which means they were too depressed to get it. The lesson was there to be seen, but the reason they didn't see it is because they were asleep in depression. See, depression puts us asleep. It's just too painful. It's too depressing. For instance, today in the church, the sexual abuse crisis, I'm convinced not a lot of people are getting this. None of us are getting it. You know, bishops, laity, everybody, we're asleep. What? Out of sheer sorrow. It's just too depressing. It is just too depressing to get. You know, we're asleep out of sheer sorrow. But then, more importantly, they were asleep in a different way. See, they were asleep out of depression, but mostly what they were asleep to was who they are. See, they were asleep to their true identity. We're normally asleep to our true identity. We're asleep to our true inner garment. They didn't know that they're, you know, I'm a child of God. I've come from God. I'm going back to God. And therefore, all things are possible for me. And what puts us asleep to that? Narcissism, pragmatism, restlessness, political ideology, political party, liberal, conservative, all these things. What they do is they make us asleep. They make us contemplatively asleep. We're asleep to our true inner garment. See, Scripture doesn't come and John doesn't say, well, I'm going to tell you about narcissism, pragmatism, and excessive restlessness, and so on. He just puts it in one image. He says, we have an inner garment, and we have outer garments. See, narcissism, pragmatism, restlessness, those are our outer garments. We're wearing them all the time. And until we take them off, we're asleep. We need to get to our true inner garment. And there, you can do Sabbath. You know, I've been using images last night. I used the image of the couple. They said, you know how we inaugurate Sabbath symbolically? We unplug our computer, we turn off the cell phones, and so on. See, they're taking off their outer garments. Okay, get the image? But there's even more deep ways to do that. You know, see, I gave it to you in analytical terminology, but in Scripture, John would say narcissism, pragmatism, excessive restlessness, all these heartaches and headaches, those are our outer garments. And when you come to Sabbath, you got to take them off. Because if you don't take them off, they're just going to take you. You know, so you can go out today and sit in the sun, and you're sitting there, but you may not be on Sabbath, because, well, your heartaches or headaches, you're inside of you, you're still doing all the business as normal. You've just stopped working, but the outer garment is still on. So Jesus got up from the table, he took off his outer garment. And then all things are possible. Now he's no longer Jesus, a Jew, you know, this and that, starting a religion or whatever. He had come from God. He's going back to God. Everything's possible for you. It's a powerful text. Like I said, it's one of the truly challenging adult texts in Scripture. And this is a text for the adults. You know, it says, you grow older, lock in on this text. How do I get all my outer garments off, at least some of the times, so that precisely I can start reaching across and embracing difference and other. Remember, in Scripture, God is always in the other. The stranger, it's not familiar that brings God. It's the stranger, the outsider. But to meet the outsider, we got to be taking off our outer garments. But to meet Sabbath, we also have to be taking off our outer garments. So today when you go out, and we're going to go finish here in 1 minute, you go out and you sit in the sun and you're drinking a beer or you're doing whatever you're doing and so on. In order to have Sabbath, you still got to shed your narcissism, pragmatism, and restlessness. John would simply say, you got to take off your outer garments. And then with your inner garment, you know, you're a child of God, you've come from God, you're going back to God. All things are possible for you.